Welcome to the DOGE Diaries, diving deep into government efficiency.
All right, let's jump right in. Did anyone else see the sheer volume of executive orders coming out? It's like a fire hose of policy.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot. I saw something about over 50 on day one, maybe even 100. It's a lot. I'm a little worried, to be honest.
It's pretty intense. The article mentions some kind of national emergency at the border, which, frankly, is just concerning. It feels like such a drastic move right off the bat, you know?
Absolutely. And the speed of it all, it's almost overwhelming. I'm wondering about the cognitive load this puts on, not just the people making these decisions, but everyone trying to process the changes. It's like your brain just gets overloaded.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, what about the people affected directly? This isn't just policy on paper. There are real lives at stake. The article mentioned the border and immigration. That's people's families and futures. And all the talk of restructuring federal jobs. What does that mean for people's stability?
It is concerning, and it feels like these decisions lack a sense of real empathy. Like, if people were approaching decision-making with more mindfulness, perhaps, they'd see these things have real human consequences. That's something I have been trying to integrate into my daily routine, those small moments of mindfulness, and I think it would benefit everyone, especially people in positions of power. Imagine if those crafting these executive orders took even just a few minutes of focused breathing before making those decisions.
That's an interesting point, because what you're essentially describing, Jesus, is reducing reactive decision-making. That's at the very core of CBT, identifying those automatic thoughts, those knee-jerk responses, and reframing them. If they were to apply CBT techniques, I wonder if it could help navigate those knee-jerk reactions and introduce more consideration for the actual impact on lives.
Right, because you could take a step back and rather than seeing people as numbers on a spreadsheet or policy documents, you could see the real human impact. It's like when you're really focused in on the rhythm of a good run, you can feel when something is a bit off with your body. Like if you're dehydrated or you're pushing too hard. It's a very direct connection between awareness and action. And if you could have that same level of sensitivity on a policy level.
Exactly. It's about cultivating that kind of sensitivity through awareness. And when I meditate and focus on sensory input, like the subtle shifts in my own energy levels, or sounds of the environment, it's amazing what you notice. I think integrating that kind of awareness is the key to improving decision-making at all levels. If we were more attuned to the consequences of our actions, big or small, we'd be less likely to cause harm, or even just do something inefficiently. It's a bit like swapping a sugary drink for herbal tea, you know? Just a small shift in awareness creates a significant improvement over time.
Yes, and that shift you're talking about can be achieved through cognitive restructuring. Like you have a thought, say, these people are bad and we need to stop them. And then, instead of reacting automatically to that thought, you actively challenge it. Where does that belief come from? Is it entirely true? What are alternative interpretations? And the article mentioned how there were some very dramatic pardons issued right away. That feels like a very strong message that you can just bypass the normal legal process.
Yeah, it's like the whole system is bypassed. That's where it gets really worrying. When there's a disconnect between the consequences and the actions, it creates a whole cascade of problems. You need to have consistency. I've been trying to keep my sleep schedule consistent, even on weekends, and just that simple change has significantly boosted my recovery rate after workouts. And it's the same with the law. It has to be consistently and fairly applied. You can't just make it up as you go along.
It's like with my meditation practice. If I don't carve out that time for stillness and focus, my mind is more likely to jump around and get caught up in reactive thought patterns. And seeing the sheer speed of all the things happening, this whole warp speed presidency, as the article calls it, it makes me wonder, where's the room for deliberation, for reflection? It all feels very impulsive.
That's the cognitive bias at play, isn't it? It's like framing things in a way that feels justified. So, if you have a pre-existing belief and you see the evidence that confirms that belief, you don't question it. It's called confirmation bias, and it's incredibly powerful. And when you couple that with the potential for cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort of holding conflicting beliefs, you get this situation where people may be making decisions based on what they want to be true, rather than what is true. And it gets amplified when you have people with large amounts of power, like this, operating from that same place. The lack of critical introspection is the really alarming part, I think.
Exactly. And it's all interconnected. Like the article touched on these foreign policy moves, these off-the-cuff pronouncements that seem like, they're completely destabilizing. When you think about how that could impact things globally, how it affects stability and long-term well-being, It's so disruptive. It's the equivalent of not having a warm up before you do a high intensity workout. It's a recipe for disaster and potential long term damage.
And it's all fueled by this us versus them mentality, which just seems so short-sighted and harmful. The article mentioned the pardons for the January 6th rioters, without any real distinction between those who committed violence and those who didn't. It just seems to promote a mindset that allows for division and conflict. And like with mindfulness, the whole point is to understand we are all interconnected, and any action will have a ripple effect outwards. Like if I overexert myself during a workout, my body will react, and I need to pay attention to that. And this is the same, on a much larger scale.
Yeah, the pardons. It's a form of moral licensing, I think. It's like, I've done this good thing by pardoning them, therefore I'm good. And it's also a validation of their actions and a denial of any personal responsibility. And the thing about moral licensing is that it's not just in politics, it's present on all levels of human interaction. So when you tell yourself, I've worked out hard today, it's okay to have a large sugary meal, then that's the same kind of cognitive bias. It's an attempt to make one decision compensate for another, but it's not addressing the root issue of healthy behavior.
Right? It's that lack of consistent self regulation. You can't just undo harm by doing good. I think with the pardons especially, it sets a dangerous precedent. It's the equivalent of saying you can skip a full night's sleep and then make up for it by having a couple of extra power naps. It doesn't work like that. You create a sleep debt, and that has a cumulative negative effect. It's the same with the law. There must be consistency and accountability.
And that lack of accountability and consistency has to impact trust, you know? If people see that the legal system can just be bypassed, it chips away at the very foundation of our society. Like in meditation, a consistent practice is key, and skipping days or not being honest with yourself completely undermines your progress. It seems that is what is happening here. A lack of consistency and accountability will have long-term negative effects.
And what's interesting is the article also talks about these massive preemptive pardons from the previous president too, which sets an even more dangerous precedent. This idea that you can just grant immunity for your friends or family who may have done something wrong. That's a massive cognitive distortion. It's like saying, I have the power so I can just change the rules to suit myself. It's complete disregard for the objective truth, isn't it? And that sort of thing can quickly spiral into not just the legal system being undermined, but an erosion of society's moral fabric.
Right, it's like if you decide you're going to run a marathon without doing any training and decide you can will yourself through it. You might be able to push through it, but you will certainly cause yourself long-term physical harm. And it's the same with those preemptive pardons. They seem like they're trying to take the easy way out. They're trying to ignore the systems we have in place. You have to build those systems and maintain them to keep them functioning properly, not tear them down whenever it suits.
And all this talk of changing the rules, it all feels so destabilizing, so lacking in compassion and understanding. Like with the immigration policy changes, that's going to have massive impact on people's lives. I just can't help thinking that there has to be a better way forward. The article also mentions some shifts in the workplace, particularly around discrimination protections, and it just feels like we're moving in the wrong direction. If, instead of using an us versus them framing, they took a more empathetic approach to policy, to understand that people have different experiences and needs, we could build policies that are actually inclusive.
And that's the crux of it, isn't it? It's the lack of perspective taking. It's about having the ability to step into someone else's shoes, see the world through their eyes. That's the heart of CBT. It's not just about your own thoughts and feelings. It's also about understanding others and then choosing your response based on compassion, not knee-jerk reactions. It's about breaking down those black and white polarized views of the world. And the executive order about birthright citizenship, that's like, well, it's a complete rejection of the whole idea that people can be treated equally under law.
Right. It's like saying I'm going to redefine the rules of this race halfway through because they don't suit me. It's so against the idea of fair play. When you exercise, you are putting yourself through physical stress in order to build strength and resilience. But you don't go around changing the rules mid-workout. And that's why consistency matters. The idea of ending birthright citizenship, for example, seems like a deeply short-sighted policy decision that would create a lot of social divisions and long-term problems. And it ignores the fact that if people were just given the opportunity to thrive, then they would contribute positively to society. It's like starving the body of nutrients, then being surprised it can't perform.
And it's also completely against the principles of empathy and compassion, which are central to all of my practices. It's about recognizing the interconnectedness of all of humanity and working toward creating an inclusive society that serves everyone, regardless of their background, not just the ones in charge. I feel that if instead of immediately taking action with policies that cause potential harm, we took the time to meditate and to be still and mindful, to actually see the value in every individual, then we could create a more harmonious and equitable society.
That emphasis on interconnectedness is key, because when you feel that sense of connection to others, you're less likely to dehumanize them. And dehumanization is really at the root of a lot of the problems the article highlights. It's easier to justify harming or excluding people when you don't see them as fully human. And all the talk about sending in troops to the border. It's not just policy, it's the complete rejection of the idea of human rights. It's another example of that black and white thinking. Like you're either on our side or you're against us. There's no room for nuance.
Exactly. It completely lacks empathy. And when you're putting that kind of stress on a system, something is bound to break. It's like if you keep pushing your body beyond its limits without rest or recovery, you risk injury. It's the same with society. If you create these huge divisions and stresses on the social fabric, something will crack. And the article mentioned those tech moguls showing up at the White House. It's very worrying because there are clear conflicts of interest there. It's like if your coach was also on the board of the company that makes your running shoes. There is a clear conflict of interest, and it's incredibly problematic.
The tech moguls joining forces and the lack of clear boundaries. It reminds me of the importance of establishing clear intentions and ethics when we meditate. If you don't, then your practice can become something quite distorted. And it seems like a similar thing is happening here. A lack of integrity is creating a potentially very harmful situation, and the speed of everything. It just amplifies the potential for long-term negative consequences. If people just took a moment of stillness to question their motivations and intentions, we would be in a better place. It's the equivalent of taking a few moments to stretch and warm up before your workout, instead of just jumping straight into it. It's those small mindful acts that really help.
Yes, and that mindful consideration of intentions, that's crucial. And what's also interesting is how the article mentions the potential for massive tariffs and trade wars, just out of the blue. That seems to be a completely impulsive decision. It shows a lack of awareness of the global implications and how it can lead to a chain reaction of harm and disruption. And it's also a massive cognitive bias that they believe it will only have benefits and not harms. It's that same distorted thinking pattern over and over again, this complete disregard of the reality.
It's like you're only seeing one part of the equation and completely ignoring the rest. I'm not an economist, but it just feels like there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how trade works. It's like you're trying to run a race without taking into account the terrain, the weather, any of the external factors that will affect the outcome. And those decisions will cause significant disruptions, not just globally, but also with people's day-to-day lives. It's just such a reckless way of operating.
It is. It's like that old saying, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The lack of awareness of other options and the total disregard for the consequences feels very unsettling. And it all comes back to those foundational values of mindfulness, compassion, and a sense of interconnectedness. If leaders would just take the time to cultivate these values, I think we'd be able to make so much more progress, more efficiently.
And that's where cognitive restructuring is so important. Because if you're stuck in this pattern of reactive black and white thinking, you're not even aware of the options. You need to be able to step back and say, okay, here's what I'm thinking, but what are the possible alternative ways of looking at this? And this seems to be completely lacking. The whole situation just feels like a massive cognitive distortion of reality, and it's incredibly concerning.
And you need to have that awareness on multiple levels too. I mean, you can be aware that you're tired, but then you push through it and your performance declines because you didn't make the necessary adjustments. It's the same with policy decisions. You can have awareness of a problem, but if you then react from a place of fear and lack of empathy, you're never going to find the best long-term solution. That consistent application of awareness, it's what really matters on both a personal and societal level.
Absolutely. And it's really about shifting from a reactive mindset to a responsive one. That's what mindfulness teaches us, and it feels especially important when considering these executive orders. Instead of just jumping in and reacting to things, taking that moment to pause, to reflect and to consider the consequences of our actions could be incredibly impactful, and it could be applied on both small scale and large scale. It's the same in meditation. If I become reactive, I am not being mindful of what is going on, and therefore I will not get the full benefit of the practice. That is what seems to be happening here on a societal scale.
That distinction between reactive and responsive is a really important one. And you could also frame it as a choice between automatic and intentional decision-making. The kind of rapid-fire executive orders, those feel very much like automatic reactions driven by fear, prejudice, and distorted thinking. Intentional decision-making is more reflective and takes into consideration many factors. It's the difference between the subconscious and conscious brain being the driving force behind an action. And it's that sort of intentionality that I feel is lacking here, and it's very worrying.
Yeah, and it's almost like these decisions are being made out of fear, out of a sense of needing to control, which is the opposite of a healthy, resilient system. You have to have that space for flexibility, for adaptation. It's like in a fitness routine, you can't be rigid and unyielding. You have to adjust according to what your body needs, what the conditions are. And when you create systems that are so rigid and controlled, you lose that adaptability, you lose that resilience.
And in that rigidity, there is a real absence of compassion. It's the opposite of what meditation encourages. It's about opening your heart, to be open and accepting of others, of their different experiences and perspectives. And this kind of thinking is about shutting down, becoming increasingly closed and isolating. It's so detrimental. And I can't help thinking that a more compassionate way of operating is not only better ethically, it's also just better for society overall.
Absolutely, and that compassionate approach starts with a willingness to challenge your own biases. Because if you're not able to identify and question the assumptions you're making, you're just going to keep perpetuating this cycle of reactive behavior. And what the article highlights is the complete absence of self-reflection, the complete inability to recognize when an action may be potentially harmful to others. And without that critical self-reflection, you're really just driving a vehicle without any knowledge of where you are going.
Yeah, and it's also the lack of flexibility, the lack of understanding that the world is complex. When you are training for a marathon, you can have a plan, but you also have to be open to change, to adapt based on how you feel and the circumstances. The same is true on a societal level. You can't be so rigid that you cannot take into account the human impact of your decisions and its lack of flexibility and that inability to adapt and respond to changing circumstances. And it just makes things unnecessarily chaotic and dysfunctional.
And it all just feels so deeply unsustainable. The lack of compassion, the lack of awareness, the lack of intention behind these actions. And it all highlights the interconnectedness of everything. And we cannot continue to treat people and the planet the way that we are. If only more people could make the conscious choice to be mindful, to be compassionate, then we would see a real shift in the way that things are, from the individual to society as a whole. And I think these decisions are ultimately an example of how important mindfulness and self-awareness are, and how detrimental it is if they are not a part of the process.
And those mindful practices can help us become less reactive and more reflective, which is what is so desperately needed. And the news cycle is just reinforcing this continuous loop of fear and anxiety. We need to be able to identify and challenge those negative thought patterns and replace them with more helpful ones. We need to be able to understand the root causes of those biases that are leading to harmful decisions, instead of making knee-jerk reactions.
Exactly. And it's about finding a sense of balance, creating systems that are both strong and flexible. You can't just focus on the high intensity moments. You also need to think about recovery and about building a sustainable system. And on a societal level, that is the way we need to move forward to create systems that are not based on fear, but on strength and on understanding that we all exist within the same ecosystem.
It's that balance that is the key, and without it, the entire system will fall apart. And that's the core of mindfulness and meditation, finding balance, finding the calm in the storm. And that approach would serve everyone well, especially in positions of leadership. So, when we cultivate that inner awareness and compassion, then we can build a more resilient, sustainable, and a more compassionate society. And so, as this cycle of executive orders and global shifts continue, I hope that more people become more aware of their own choices and their impact on the collective.
Yeah, that's a good place to stop. That level of awareness is crucial, and it's the only way we're going to avoid repeating these patterns in the future.
Agreed. It's about moving forward with intention and with an understanding of the interconnectivity of all things.